Okay, I think we'll make a start. It's 1 o'clock. So, hello again. So we're going to continue on with our agricultural topic, and this is part 2. So, last time we talked about, started talking about some of these drivers of environmental damage and alteration that can be a consequence of intensive agriculture. So we looked at habitat loss, the effect of pesticides and genetically modified crops. And today I want to touch on nitrogen inputs and pollution, which leads to eutrophication, irrigation that can give rise to salinisation, and soil degradation and erosion. So, starting with nitrogen. So, on Tuesday I described the benefit that nitrogen input obviously has on crops. Obviously, nitrogen is an essential nutrient, and its addition onto crops can substantially enhance crop growth and therefore crop productivity. And the key breakthrough in the 20th century in terms of improved agricultural productivity was the invention of the Haber-Bosch process, the invention that we could generate our own artificial ammonium without utilising natural sources that we could then input onto crops. And it's important when we think about nitrogen inputs to be aware of what forms of nitrogen we're talking about. Of course, there's a lot of nitrogen around us, so the air is predominantly nitrogen gas, but of course for most organisms that nitrogen gas is biologically unavailable. We can't utilise that nitrogen gas, plants can't utilise that nitrogen gas. It's only nitrogen when it's in the form of ammonium or nitrate, perhaps through other sources such as urea, depending on the species, that nitrogen can then be taken up and assimilated and used. So then once we demonstrate that we have the ability to make ammonium, which is a usable form of nitrogen in very large quantities, we could start putting that onto our fields and enhancing crop productivity. And so you can see from maps such as this that we've now had the ability to do this. We're putting significant proportions of nitrogen onto our land. So this map is showing the quantification of nitrogen input derived from anthropogenic sources, so from our own fertiliser input, quantified as the amount of nitrogen on an area basis, so per kilometre squared per year. And what you're seeing with these areas in the kind of the black and dark red colours, we're seeing substantial, significant inputs of nitrogen being utilised. So in most of Europe, in most of the corn and wheat growing regions of North America, also India, and the major wheat and rice growing areas of Southeast Asia and China are showing significant levels of nitrogen inputs. But this nitrogen input is, unfortunately, generally inefficient. Only a proportion of that nitrogen is being utilised by the crops. A lot of that nitrogen, sometimes as much as 50% of that nitrogen, is being lost, and it's being lost through a number of different routes. So there's 3 main routes by which nitrogen is being lost off of the crop, which are shown here. So we've got nitrous oxide emissions from the soils. We've got ammonia emissions from manure and fertiliser, and we've got runoff and leaching of different forms of nitrogen, which are shown in this image here. So if we start with fertiliser, so the farmer is adding fertiliser to his field, which is either in the form of nitrate fertiliser or ammonium fertiliser. That's being added, and also in addition we can further provide some nitrogen to the field by the planting of nitrogen fixing plants, so legumes, for example, which themselves can generate their own internal Haber-Bosch process. They can themselves fix gaseous nitrogen and convert that into ammonium. So we've got different routes by which bioavailable nitrogen can be added onto a field. And a proportion of that nitrogen will be taken up into plants. But some of it is lost. So some of the fertiliser that's added will be, can be easily run off from the surface due to excess rainfall or excess irrigation, particularly if the field has a gradient or is sloped. A lot of that fertiliser is very easily and very frequently run off where it then enters surface waters. Now, ammonium, which is the bulk of a fertiliser that we're adding onto the crops, but ammonium is not a particularly mobile ion. It doesn't diffuse through the soil that easily. But when it does come into contact with certain classes of bacteria in the soil, the ammonium can then be readily converted into nitrite or nitrate. So this is nitrification. So microorganisms that can perform nitrification reactions will convert that ammonium into nitrites or nitrates, and those forms are much more mobile than ammonium, and they can very readily diffuse through the soil and leach down into the groundwater. And then, so when there's substantial ammonium inputs that are then converted into substantial quantities of nitrates, they can then readily pollute groundwater. So we've got both runoff, surface runoff from fertiliser and soil leaching from nitrates that can lead to a lot of substantial loss of nitrogen from that initial input. In addition, there's also bacteria in the soil that can perform a denitrification reaction. So this nitrite or nitrate can be converted into either nitrogen gas or nitrous oxide that can be emitted into the atmosphere. And this is quite a substantial loss of nitrogen as well. Nitrous oxide is particularly concerning because it's also a significant greenhouse gas, which I'll talk a bit more about in the next lecture. And so this also is a major route for atmospheric nitrogen pollution that, as I'll come back to in a moment, can also have quite substantial deleterious consequences. So we've got runoff and leaching, we've got emissions of nitrous oxide, and then also some of the fertiliser at the surface, also animal waste, so manure and urea, can also themselves give off ammonia, and that's the third route of loss of nitrogen. So this is an evaluation of this nitrogen loss at this fairly local scale, and the predominant key fact here is this pollution into water sources, into surface waters and groundwater. We can also look at this human nitrogen input effects at a more global scale, and we can see that human intervention by addition of fertiliser is also affecting this nitrogen cycle. It's altering the balance of this global nitrogen cycle. So these purple arrows indicate the natural processes that take place, and the brown arrows indicate these anthropogenic inputs, predominantly via agriculture and also a little bit through fossil fuel contributions. Now, if we look at the terrestrial aspects of this cycle, naturally this is generally in balance. So the amount of nitrogen inputs that happen naturally through microbial nitrogen fixation and then the natural denitrification that takes place is generally a balanced process. But when we're adding artificially nitrogen into the environment by fertiliser application, we're substantially skewing the balance and putting much greater than the natural inputs of nitrogen into the terrestrial environment. And then once there is much greater pools of nitrogen in the soils, as I discussed in the last slide, there's then substantial leaching of that nitrogen that then makes its way into waters and ultimately into the sea, into the marine environment. There are also natural processes that are taking place here, but when there's much greater nitrogen being leached into the sea through agricultural runoff, then there's also a substantial risk of further nitrous oxide emissions, because denitrification reactions are also substantially greater in marine environments. The microorganisms in the sea can drive quite substantial nitrous oxide emissions if the nitrogen input going into the sea is substantial. So this is also a big concern with regard to greenhouse gas emission. And some studies have started to quantify this loss of nitrogen, this leaching of nitrogen, which is shown in this data here. So this graph's plotting the amount of nitrogen that's leached on a rate basis, so the amount of nitrogen per hectare per year, based on different amounts of surplus nitrogen. So as I said, only a proportion of this nitrogen is being taken up and used by the plants, by the crops, and then there's a lot of nitrogen that's left over, that's surplus. And in a typical arable environment, almost all of that surplus nitrogen is being lost, is being leached away. So only at fairly small surpluses, you're starting to get quite significant concentrations of leaching. In contrast, a natural grassland is actually much better at retaining some of this surplus nitrogen. It's particularly due to the microorganisms that are in these grassland soils. They're able to hang on to that nitrogen much more efficiently. They're able to bind and utilise that nitrogen. So you get hardly any leaching unless you're starting to reach really high levels of surplus nitrogen. So basically, the arable lands are much poorer at retaining nitrogen and drive substantial leaching of nitrogen into aquatic environments. And this is then when we lead to eutrophication. I briefly introduced this on Monday, which is where these inputs of nitrogen can then drive these large algal blooms. So this nitrogen input is really driving fast growth rate of these photosynthetic unicellular organisms, and can lead to these really quite substantial blooms that you can see on this satellite image of the parts of the Gulf of Mexico. So these blooms can very quickly develop, and as they develop, they block sunlight, entering into the water column. So any plants such as seagrass that are growing at the seabed will die off because they're not getting any light. They will die off. They'll start to decompose. The algal bloom will also, over time, decompose, and this decomposing material will suck up oxygen. It's got high biological oxygen demand, and that will then generate these hypoxic, these oxygen lacking zones within the water. That will also kill off any zooplankton in the water because there's no oxygen. So you get a lot of dead areas of water. And in addition, the water quality, particularly from a freshwater perspective, is extremely poor. So a lot of the algae, particularly when it's cyanobacterial blooms, can give off toxins, which can be either very hazardous or in some cases can kill. And also when nitrates are at high concentrations, they can also be particularly toxic, particularly to small children utilising this drinking water. So this is a big impact. Particularly we see this in Europe, in coastal zones, and there are a number of parts of the world where freshwater, so internal freshwaters, lakes, rivers, are also showing signs of quite substantial eutrophication and pollution as a result. So that's the aquatic challenge with this pollution. I also said that there's substantial emissions into the atmosphere from this nitrogen load. And this figure is just quantifying this atmospheric nitrogen deposition and pollution. This is showing it on a landscape scale, and we can see in certain areas where are particularly susceptible to high levels of nitrogen deposition, particularly linked to areas of higher rainfall. And we can see that while the bulk of this deposited nitrogen pollutants are oxidized forms of nitrogen, so nitrous oxides, we've also got a substantial amount of this deposited nitrogen derived from ammonia and ammonium sources, which is essentially exclusively agricultural derived. So while some of this nitric oxide is from industry and from road transport, and you'll hear a bit more about that from Amanda Bamford in about a week's time, a substantial amount of this deposition is also agriculturally derived. And this air-deposited nitrogen, it's a particularly concern for human health. It can be quite chronic. It's quite a chronic pollutant for human health, but it's also particularly damaging to plant communities. So this is one set of data from across the UK, clearly showing that as the amount of atmospheric nitrogen pollution increases, the species richness of plant communities also significantly decreases. And we see a similar pattern across Europe as well, and indeed across the world. It's a consistent conserved response. As nitrogen pollutant concentrations increase, the effect this has on species richness is very significant. And the reason for this is because the nitrogen pollutants that are depositing on plants are damaging to plant leaves. It causes foliar damage. Some plants are more sensitive than others, so lichens, okay, they're not specifically plants, but these photosynthetic symbionts and also mosses are particularly sensitive to foliar damage. In fact, so much so that they are often good indicators of nitrogen pollution. When particular classes of these organisms disappear, it's a good indication that there's substantial nitrogen pollution in an environment. The higher nitrogen deposition also promotes the faster growing of species that are able to tolerate this higher input of nitrogen, in contrast to species that are more adapted to low nitrogen environments and are not able to tolerate higher nitrogen burden. So what you end up with actually is fewer species, just a few species that are able to tolerate this higher nutrient load. And then in addition, as I'll mention in a moment, this nitrogen deposition can also increase the acidity of the soil. So what we may find is a situation like this one shown in this photo, where this is a heathland, but it doesn't no longer look like a heathland. It's no longer dominated purely by heather. We've got this plant, this Mollina, which is a high nitrogen adaptive plant. It's out-competing the heather. It's able to adapt and dominate in this high nitrogen environment and completely change the habitat here and completely change this plant community. So I mentioned acidification. This is one of the other consequences of high nitrogen inputs, particularly due to ammonium deposition. So pH in most soils is usually maintained at a fairly stable rate, and natural nitrogen cycling processes maintain pH balance. So nitrogen is constantly being broken down from decaying organic matter, so decaying plants, decaying animals will release organic nitrogen that's then broken down in the soil by microorganisms. So there's ammonification reactions which will convert that organic nitrogen into ammonium, and that reaction consumes protons. Protons, of course, are key determinant in the pH of the soil and the acidity of the soil. But then the nitrification reaction, which we've already heard about, which converts the ammonium into nitrate, this process produces protons. And then the assimilation, the uptake and assimilation of nitrate by the plants, this also releases hydroxides. And together this consumption and production of protons and production of hydroxides maintains the pH in balance. But when we're adding ammonium into the soil, this is bypassing this ammonification pathway, but generating a build-up of ammonium without this consumption of protons, but actually, because there's more ammonium, there's more nitrification taking place, which is driving a greater production of protons. And the net result is that you get a build-up of protons in the soil. This is building up acidity in the soil. And this can be a problem because acidity, the pH of a soil, is a really critical determinant of the bioavailability of different elements, different essential mineral elements in the soil. So soils that are on the more alkaline side tend to have a higher abundance of forms of elements like calcium and magnesium, potassium, etc., that are able to be more readily accumulated by biological organisms, whereas the mineral elements, like those shown here, are less available. And in contrast, in more acidic soils, it's much harder for the plants and animals to take up these macronutrients like calcium, magnesium, potassium, because the change in pH is changing the chemical speciation of these elements. They're not in a form that's readily accumulated because they form complexes with other ligands, an organic material, whereas the metal minerals are much more bioavailable. They're much more in a free ionic form, which is able to be taken up by organisms. Plants like growing in soils around about this kind of window of about pH 6.5, pH 7. It gives the ideal optimal balance of these elements to be taken up. Whereas if the soil is more acidic, they are not able to take up as much of the macronutrients that they need, but they're also exposed to much higher concentrations of these metals than they need. Particularly aluminium and manganese can be quite toxic to the plants, and this can give rise to metal toxicity. So acidic soils are quite toxic to plants, both due to the acidity itself, but also due to this downstream metal toxicity. So a lot of plants are sensitive, and this reduces biodiversity of plant communities. And also from a crop perspective, there's a lot of crops that are quite sensitive, as shown here, to acidity. Although indeed there are some crops that are more tolerant to acid soils, such as rye, such as oat. And then this eutrophication, so this higher nitrogen inputs into soils and this acidity, also makes plants more sensitive to other perturbations and other stresses. So higher soil accumulation and therefore higher nitrogen content in the plants also makes the plants more attractive to herbivory. So they're more likely to be eaten by small animals and insects and other pathogens. So they're more attractive to being eaten. And also they're more sensitive to other stresses like droughts. And this is because when there's a high nutrients concentration in the soil, the plants don't need to put a lot of energy into growing roots to try and acquire these nutrients. So root growth is less. They have smaller roots. But the consequence of this is when there's less water available in the soil, such as under drought condition, the plants are less efficient at acquiring water from the soil. So they're much more sensitive to water loss when drought conditions occur. And all this has a knock-on effect to a whole range of other animals in these habitats, as we would expect. So these impacts on plant composition, on the nutrient composition of plants, all has knock-on effects with insects and other invertebrates that are dependent on particular plant types for their nutrition and also as a habitat. So this is an example with this bird, this red-backed shrike. It's an insectivorous bird. It feeds on insects and small vertebrates. And what was found in the Netherlands, it's particularly a dune habitat species. The composition of the dunes was substantially changed by a lot of nitrogen runoff from the fields. This substantially altered the amount of prey available to this bird, and this has led to quite substantial declines in the population of the shrike. And then finally, with regard to soil microorganisms, these are also particularly sensitive to changes both in the nitrogen content and also these indirect consequences such as the change in pH of the soil. So a lot of fungi, a lot of bacteria are very sensitive to acidity and the richness of the both fungal and abundance and fungal species and bacterial species will change as the soil becomes more acidic. So particularly we see a reduction in fungal abundance. Some microbial activities will increase. So I mentioned that there's microbes that drive nitrification reactions and denitrification reactions. They're responsive to nitrogen status in the soil. So when there's more nitrogen, these types of microbes will increase in activity. But other microorganisms that are not dependent on nitrogen status will reduce in abundance. And this includes bacteria and fungi that drive decomposition of organic matter. So decomposition rates typically fall under high nitrogen concentrations. Acidification also inhibits this decomposition process, and we see much greater emissions of this nitrous oxide. And then finally, as plant community composition changes, this also alters microbial composition, because there's a really tight relationship between plant community structure and microbial structure, because plants are providing carbon for these microorganisms, and as they change, the microbe community structure also changes. So this figure just essentially summarises these key aspects of the nitrogen impacts. So we've got high levels of nitrogen input into crops, which, as I described, is driving nitrogen leaching and eutrophication. It's also driving increased emissions of nitrous oxide. That's altering greenhouse gas balances and also impairing air quality, as we said. So it's also driving more nitrogen pollutants into the air. And this is all giving rise to loss of biodiversity, these impacts in the soil, both acidification and the nitrogen pollution. These known consequences of nitrogen input are leading a number of researchers to propose critical loads, limits that should be imposed on restricting the amount of nitrogen that's added into the environment. So ideally there should be legislation that will recommend specific concentrations, maximal concentrations of nitrogen that can be added into the environment to prevent these consequences that I've described. But it's not simply that there should be a one set concentration that should be the limit, because it's more complex than this. What research has shown, as summarised in this table, is that different habitats, different ecosystems have different sensitivities to nitrogen input. So the likes of Arctic and alpine scrublands and peatlands are much more sensitive to nitrogen input than, say, heathlands or grasslands. So although all of these environments are sensitive to nitrogen input, there is differential sensitivity. And therefore, it's been proposed that there should be differential critical loads dependent on the environment where any agricultural activity is taking place. Okay, so that's nitrogen, the impacts of nitrogen pollution. And for the last sort of 20 minutes, I just now want to focus on some of the challenges, some of the other challenges to soils under agricultural processes. So we're going to touch on both soil degradation and salinisation of soil. Now, soil is a critical component of agricultural systems. So it's a critical component of life on the planet overall. And it's often something that we may take for granted or really forget about. And even some people, I've done outreach activities with children in schools or general public, and asking them, what is soil? It tends to be often disregarded as anything important. It's just dirt that's out there. It's just something that plants grow in. But of course, soil is a very both complex and important component of life on this planet. It's, of course, a mixture of minerals, of organic material. Obviously, it holds water, it's got air pockets, The organic material is a lot of dead life, so dead plants, insects, other animals and invertebrates, but also a lot of living organisms. The living organism is a key component of the makeup of a soil. So there's a range of invertebrates, insects, earthworms, but particularly a huge abundance of soil microorganisms, both bacterial and fungal, that play essential processes in driving nutrient cycling, carbon cycling, and drive the viability of that soil. So the soil itself it's a matrix that's providing anchorage for plants. Obviously the roots are being anchored in this soil, but of course also it's the source of the essential nutrients that the plants and other organisms need to acquire. It's holding water. And also this point about regulating climate is also important to remember. A lot of carbon gets sequestered in soils, pulled down from plants. So plants are fixing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, converting that into organic carbon. That obviously a lot of that is being used for their growth, but also a lot of that organic carbon is being secreted out of the roots into the soil in different forms. Some of it as CO2, a lot of it as various forms of organic carbon secreted into the soil. So there's a lot of carbon that's stored in the soil, and actually it's a key component that we need to bear in mind in terms of carbon sequestration and climate change. And when the soil is perturbed, when biological processes are perturbed, both CO2 emissions and nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions from soil will increase and can increase quite substantially. And the other key thing to remember is that this is a very slowly renewable resource. It's almost a non-renewable resource in the sense that it can take a heck of a lot of time for this soil to produce. So depending on the type of soil, between about 200 to 400 years for a 1 centimetre layer of soil to be generated. So it has a very slow regeneration process. So when we lose it, we are losing that soil for a very long time. And it's been estimated that about half of the topsoil that planet Earth has ever had has been lost in the last 150 years, which is really quite a startling statistic. And a lot of our world soils are currently at risk for, with regard to degradation. And of course, because we're dependent on these soils for growing our crops, this soil degradation is a significant issue for our food security. So, as I say, soil degradation, it's a problem all over the globe. This is just showing some data for Europe. A lot of European soils are being lost at quite fast rates, particularly in southern Europe and bits of Western Britain. And there are various reasons by which soil can be damaged and degraded. One of them is acidification, which we've already touched on. Another reason, another process of degradation is erosion. This is obviously clear degradation. It's complete loss, complete erosion away of the soil. And I'll talk about some of the mechanisms of erosion in the next slide. But it's also important to remember that this erosion is also driving pollution. As the soil particles get eroded away, these small soil particles will pollute water sources. So it's also a big challenge to fresh water quality when erosion takes place. Compaction damages soil. So when there's excessive use of heavy machinery, heavy farm machinery, also excessive grazing by livestock, this can heavily compact the soil. And this compaction can reduce the efficiency of water to infiltrate into the soil and can increase any runoff of fertilisers and other chemicals from the field, and can also increase emissions of nitrous oxide. Loss of structure of the soil is also a big problem. So again, poor agricultural management can damage soil structure, particularly excessive tillage. or excessive ploughing can damage the structure of the soil. So the soil is less efficient at holding water and holding nutrients, and has much poorer aeration, which all inhibits the efficient growth of any plants growing on that soil, and likewise any animals grazing on that land when plant growth is impaired. And finally, salinity, which we'll come to in a moment, which can be induced by, obviously both naturally, but also artificially through poor irrigation, will also damage soils because it reduces the ability of plants to grow in that soil, and also microorganisms and other invertebrates living in that soil. So there's a whole host of different types of degradation types and processes, and overwhelmingly it's agricultural practice that's driving this soil damage. Okay, so I mentioned soil erosion. This is a big challenge. As I said, we are losing a lot of soil, and we've already lost a lot of soil. And there's a whole range of processes that are driving these soil erosion processes. And a lot of them are clearly linked to intensive agricultural practice. One of them is overgrazing. So overgrazing the land, leading to increased reduction of vegetation. Obviously, that vegetation is playing a key role through those roots, anchoring those soils together. And as the soil gets exposed, more of those soil particles can be weathered away, can be wind blown away, and there's over time a slow but sustained erosion of that soil. Likewise, deforestation is doing a similar thing. We're removing all of this this plant matter that's binding all of this soil together, and therefore it's greatly more susceptible to erosion. And similarly, other poor agricultural practices can intensify this. So, for example, if there's poor practice of feeding livestock. So, for example, if a same location of a field is always being used as a site to feed the animals, those animals are always going to that same site, and they're weathering away and eroding away that soil over time. Particularly if it's a site on a riverbank, you might often see any sort of cattle sort of go down to the edge of the river, and the action of their hooves, they're not slowly knocking the soil away, and it gets eroded away into the river, washed out, ultimately into the sea, and that soil is lost. Also, if fields are kept uncovered for too long periods of time during winter months, again, this is driving more erosion as vegetation is kept away. And soil erosion is also comes hand in hand with loss of soil carbon. Again, due to poor management practice, as I said, a lot of this carbon is being sequestered into the soil through plant action, through carbon fixation and carbon sequestration, and a lot of that carbon is directly associated with the plant roots. So as this plant matter is removed, so if a farmer wants to completely clear out any plant residue from his field, say the end of the harvest, if he completely removes the crop and the stubble or the roots, that's also removing a lot of carbon from that soil. And if this continues year after year, carbon will be continuously lost. Drainage of wetlands, which I talked about on Tuesday, also leads to quite substantial carbon loss from soils. This has consequences because, as I said, this is also when carbon is being lost in this organic form, in this plant-associated form in the soil. It's also driving then more carbon dioxide emissions from the soil. The carbon in the soil also, when it's lacking, drives more soil erosion, because otherwise this organic carbon is almost acting like a glue. It's helping compact the soil together, and when the organic component is reduced, the soil dries out much more quickly, and it can be more susceptible to wind erosion. And the organic matter plays a critical role in the soil. It's a key pool for mineral binding, It also helps in holding water capacity, and critically, it's important as a carbon source for the bacterial and fungal microorganisms that are living in this soil. So organic carbon, it's critical for healthy soil. So we can think of it as a healthy soil indicator. Okay, and finally, water use. We're going to just briefly mention water use in agriculture. So, as I'm sure you all know, freshwater use is an increasing concern as it's becoming much more of a scarce resource, but particularly because it's increasingly heavily used, as this graph shows, by agriculture. So for our own drinking and washing and other uses of domestic uses of water, it's quite a small proportion of the total amounts of fresh water we draw from reserves. Industrial uses, again, relatively moderate overall, but it's the agricultural use that's really quite substantial and has grown, as you can see here, quite substantially over the last century as the agricultural demands for fresh water has grown, as our population demands for food productivity has grown. And consequently, we're utilising or needing to use irrigation much more than we had in the past. And this is further exacerbated by increasing frequency of drought. Our climate's changing and drought incidents are increasing, and therefore there's further need for water inputs onto our crops, as we can't purely rely on rainfall. So this has been a key driver for requiring irrigation. So it's both population growth, needing more in itself. We need more water, so the portion of water that's available for agriculture is reducing. Also, the need to grow food is requiring more irrigation of our crops. And a substantial amount of crop production does require irrigation. So between 20 to 40% of crop cultivation is irrigated. The amount of water, the amount of irrigation that crops need depends on the food stuff that we're wanting to grow. So this table is just comparing different food stuffs. So in green we've got plant-based foods, and then in blue here I've got animal-based foods, and just comparing the amount of water per kilogram of that food stuff that is needed. So what we can see is that some of these plant types, obviously we've got groupings here of different species, but so generally vegetables require a fairly modest amount of water per kilogram, so only about 300 litres per kilogram, whereas cereals per kilogram of, say, wheat grain or rice grain, we're talking about over 1,500 litres. Nuts, particularly water, requiring quite a substantial amount of water needed there. But when we're going into the animal produce, here we are requiring much more water. And of course, this is largely the water that's required to generate the grain, the plant food or fodder that's then fed to these animals. And on a per kilogram basis, much greater water is needed. So beef, for example, is extremely water intensive. So about 10 times the amount of water is needed per kilogram of beef than it is per kilogram of wheat or rice grain. And the big challenge with excessive irrigation is it gives rise to this, to salinisation, this accumulation of salt on the field. So the water that's been added onto the field contains some soluble salts. And as water evaporates, it leaves those salts behind. And then over time, as this process increases, you tend to then get this build-up of salt, and it increases to a stage where, I mean, this is an extreme example, but a stage where the field is just no longer able to be used productively. It's no longer economically viable for agricultural production. It's abandoned. So this is particularly a problem in arid and semi-arid environments where evaporation rates are increased. And also these locations tend to have lower levels of rainfall anyway, so irrigation inputs are required more. The form of the water, the type of water that's irrigated is also critical here. So if it's water that's near coastal, if it's kind of more brackish or saline water, obviously there's much higher concentration of salt in that water, so that's inputting much higher concentration of salt onto the land. Groundwater has much higher salt concentration than surface waters, so again that's giving rise to greater salt input when that water does evaporate. It also depends on the drainage characteristics of a soil and the level of the groundwater. And as the groundwater rises, this also increases the incidence of development of salinisation. This map just shows the major salt-affected regions at the moment across the world. So a lot of coastal regions, and also a lot of the arid and semi-arid regions. And we're talking about 13% currently of our cultivated land is affected by high concentrations of salt. And of the land that's irrigated, about 50% of that is salt affected. So, and equally as our global climate is changing, as sea levels are rising, the coastal areas are becoming more salt affected. They are also becoming more prone to salinisation of these coastal arable lands. And this is, of course, a big problem for crop cultivation. Plants don't like growing in salty areas particularly well for various reasons. So the salt itself, particularly sodium chloride salt, is very toxic to most plants. It will inhibit the plant growth. This inhibition is partly due to imbalance of nutrients, so increased concentration of salts will make it harder for the plants to take up essential salts, such as essential nutrients such as potassium. It also increases drought stress when there's a high concentration of salt in the soil solution, which makes it harder for plants to acquire the water into the roots, so they're more water deficit susceptible. So crop plant growth is inhibited and is limited. At an overall plant community perspective, biodiversity is limited on more saline lands, and also other invertebrates and microorganisms are very sensitive to salt. So actually a lot of organisms are sensitive to high levels of salt, apart from a few that have adapted, and these are rarer species, so the overall species abundance and species composition is reduced. So what can we do? Well, managing this, well, certainly overcoming a salt-contaminated land is very challenging. Once an area is very salt-contaminated, it's actually quite challenging, quite expensive, and not particularly efficient to return that land to a productive state. You can bulk remove that salt from the land, but it's very costly and it's not always that efficient. So what is much better is to introduce agronomic practices that restrict the problem occurring in the first place. And one of which is much better drainage processes, such as illustrated in this diagram here, whereby there's an inhibition of poor drainage characteristics that's restricting the accumulation of salt after irrigation in the first place. Okay, so I shall leave it there. So here's some references that go into a bit more details if you want to follow on from some of these aspects. And I stuck the links to the full text of these articles on the Blackboard site. And also I've put on a couple of additional web resources. So there's one from the World Wildlife Fund, one from the FAO, the UN, a couple of others, which also cover aspects relating to nitrogen pollution, poor irrigation practice, and soil erosion, etc., that you might find useful. And next time, on Monday, we're going to cover greenhouse gas emissions deriving from agriculture. And then you can measure. You can measure how much
okay. It's probably a pulled fire alarm. We'll go that direction. Don't worry, it's probably safe.